All right. So, good evening, everyone, to all our viewers, and welcome to the latest iteration of the Probe interviews. Today, we are joined by the Honourable Mr. Edward Luce. He is the US National Editor and columnist at the Financial Times. He is the author of highly acclaimed books, including the 2007 publication In Spite of the Gods, The Strange Rise of Modern India. And he also appears regularly on CNN, NPR, MSNBC, and other noted news portals. Thank you so much for your time, sir. Bit on us. We are Caucus Discussion Forum of Hindu College. We are a non-partisan think tank based out of the University of Delhi, and the Probe is a student-run monthly magazine backed by students of Caucus in 2020 to cultivate a writing culture and, more importantly, to gain and to learn more from renowned experts like you. And once again, on behalf of the Edward and the entire society, thank you so much for your time. It's incredible to have someone of your stature speak to us. Right.
It's very kind of you to invite me on. It's a pleasure.
Right. Thank you so much. So, beginning with the questions, you had an expansive career covering global politics. I would like to begin by asking how your perception of the socio-political landscape in India and the United States has evolved since the last cycle of elections held in both countries in 2019 and 2020, respectively.
Those are two enormous democracies and very large questions. It's hard for me to synthesize a quick elevator pitch answer for you, but the United States is in a period, depending on how you look at it, and of course, when you look back at things from a greater distance, they take on a completely different light than often than how you look at the time. But right now, we're in an anti-incumbency frame of mind. Each presidential election in the United States, there's a change of the incumbent gets thrown out. But it's against the backdrop of being an extremely divided 50-50 nation, essentially. They're always very close. And the depth, it's not just the evenness of America's division, it's the depth of its polarization is really something quite new over the last sort of 10-15 years in American politics, and potentially extremely troubling to the future of the republic. So that's just a very, very sort of brief thumbnail of where we are in the wake of Trump's re-election a few weeks ago. India is, in a very different position, I think, Democrat in terms of its democracy and its electorate's mood. Modi, the BJP is clearly, now a third consecutive term in office, but a much reduced mandate. I had the interesting experience of doing a long fireside conversation with Rahul Gandhi here in Washington, D.C. earlier this year, well, probably in September, so a few months after the Indian election. And although Congress and the India sort of a coalition had not won the election, he was sort of talking and acting as though it was kind of a victory. And I guess relative to what the BJP had set itself as a target, sort of up to 400 seats, and to Modi's sort of expectations, it was a defeat of sorts. It was certainly a check on the BJP's idea of it being a sort of eternal majority. So it was a very interesting election because it does set up the possibility of an actual defeat of the BJP post-Modi in 2029. And I think, the Indian politics has presidentialized, or maybe that's an understatement. Modi is a sort of different kind of figure and therefore irreplaceable. You can't imagine Amit Shah replacing Modi. And so it does make 2029 look like a very interesting long haul. I don't know whether there's going to be another Rahul Gandhi Yatra, and I don't think Congress on its own is ever capable really of coming back as a single party majority. But Indian politics, it looks open for the first time in more than a decade, and that is interesting. But they're very, very different stages and political constellations in India and the United States. So I find it quite hard to bracket them.
Thank you so much for in-depth answer, sir. And you spoke of polarization within both the countries. So I had this question on my mind for a long time. So On the topic of polarized voters and anti-incumbency, as you mentioned, Indian and US elections have provided us with case studies in very stark contrast. Many Hindu majority constituencies in India chose not to vote for the BJP in 2024, while many minority heavy counties in the USA, which heavily voted Democrat in 2020, either did not turn out in the same numbers or flipped Republican altogether. So, what are your opinions on the minority vote in 2024, and why do you think such a stark difference in minority vote emerged between minority voters of India and the US?
Yeah, it's an interesting puzzle. I mean, the United States, you can look at it in terms of ethnic minorities, Hispanics, African Americans, and so forth. And you're right, there was a marked, continued shift to the Republicans, or more precisely, to Trump Republicans, of a lot of American minorities. Or you can look at it through the lens of class. And I think class is actually a little bit more illuminating. Essentially, what's happened is the Democratic Party, the center-left party, has ceased to be the party of the working class. And that was always its one of its key raison d'etres, and one of its sort of basic rationales is that they are the party of the economically disadvantaged. And so it is an extraordinary phenomenon that it's not just white working classes voting for Trump. It's Hispanics. Almost half of Hispanics voted for Trump. And between a fifth and a quarter of African Americans, which in many respects is an even more startling number, given how strong African Americans are as part of the democratic identity. In the same way, maybe a generation ago, you would have said Muslim voters are just a sort of core part of the Congress Party's identity. And coincidentally, they're roughly the same share of India's population of Muslims, America's population of African Americans. I think what we're getting is a sort of, certainly in America, we're getting a much more restless, pragmatic, non-partisan sort of mood amongst what I would call the low information voter. They don't have any strong ideological dispositions. They weren't particularly intimidated by the idea that Trump is a threat to democracy or to constitutional order. They think either that doesn't matter, it won't affect them, or else it's just Trump's shtick. It's just him sort of always exaggerating cartoonishly about what he's going to do. Either way, I think they felt that pre-COVID they had rising incomes, and since COVID they haven't, and therefore it was simply an inflation-related, an anti-inflation-related vote against the incumbents in a year, it ought to be said, around the world, where incumbents have been swept out of power. India being the strong exception to that, but as we've noted, it was still a surprising check on Narendra Modi's authority, I think. So I'm much nowadays less familiar with the granular sort of trends in Indian democracy, and I haven't been back to India for a while, since before COVID. I should sort of give you that health warning. But I think that there is a similarity here between elites in the media, the universities, educated elites, who tend to see sort of values issues and questions of principle as very important, and overlook the degree to which things like inflation in America, or just the provision of safe toilets for women, just how important that is, and more important, values are a sort of luxury you can afford when you've reached a certain income and education level. And I think we continue and you're at Delhi University, in the cognitive elites, to underestimate just how important these bread and butter issues are to people, and how little ideology really impacts on how they vote. And so, this is part of the genius of how Modi is governed, is that he's recognized that and provided genuine material improvements to people at the grassroots level, certainly the urban grassroots level in India. And that just doesn't register to somebody sitting in Lachin's Delhi in the same way it does, if you're in one of those slums that is getting clean water for the first time.
Right, sir. Thank you so much for that answer. But I was rather intrigued by your statement regarding how the Democratic Party is not necessarily a representative of the social party agenda, right? So there is a popular perception that politicians in the United States aren't left leaning enough. And this notion has further increased now that many people believe that one of the key reasons for Kamala Harris's defeat in the elections was her moderate position on issues such as Gaza. So, what would you say your opinion is on such commentary? And do you believe that this so called inherent right wing nature of American politics makes matters difficult for the Democratic Party because they come under a situation where they have to convince voters to not vote Republican as opposed to voting Democrat?
Yeah, I mean, we live in an age of negative polarization, so a negative partisanship, which means a lot of the votes are motivated by hatred of the other rather than an embrace of the positive agenda of who you're voting for. I think in a 50-50 country where there's an electoral college, like you have in the United States, and therefore it boils down to a handful of swing states where a few thousand votes here and there are going to flip the whole election outcome. And this election was decided by 234,000 voters across 7 swing states. If 234,000 voters had voted differently, Kamala Harris would have won. So that's a tiny, tiny fraction. It's like a nano sort of measure of a country of 340 million people. So you can't really identify any one thing that would change. It's many things. And Gaza, of course, and the reaction of Arab Americans, particularly in Michigan, where they're concentrated, against the record of the Biden-Harris administration was real. It was visceral, and it probably made the difference in Michigan to the outcome. But since Trump took all 7 swing states, including ones with no Arab Americans and very small student populations, you can't really attribute, her defeat to that. It's certainly one of the contributors. And the Democratic argument, the Harris campaign's argument that, look, it will be worse under Trump, might well, for Palestinians, might well be borne out. I mean, if you look at his early appointments, they're ultra hawkish. If you look at his proposed nominated ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee is a Christian evangelist, who has this sort of belief, which is a very strange sort of theology, but it's mainstream. Well, not mainstream, it's very common in the United States amongst certain Christian groups that the end of days, the second coming of Christ, will only occur once Israel occupies all its ancestral territory, and that includes the West Bank and Gaza. Judea and Samaria is the name that, and so it's a politically philo-Semitic, pro-Semitic position that the evangelicals in America take, but it's a theologically anti-Semitic one, because the end of days is where the unrighteous get slaughtered, and that includes all the Jews. So it's kind of a Faustian pact between the right in Israel and the Christian right in the United States. And I don't think Arab American voters in Michigan are particularly happy with that, will be particularly happy with the annexation of the West Bank, if indeed that goes ahead. I have to say, though, as a sort of, what's the word for it, caveat to what I've just said, that because the Trump brand has a great affinity with the House of Saud, there's a sort of similar way of doing business, fairly corrupt, a love of, gilded this and bling that and golden toilet seats and all the sort of weird tastes you get Mar-a-Lago and in various Saudi palaces. The best hope probably for the Palestinians is a US brokered deal involving the Saudi recognition of Israel. And the Saudis would have a minimum demand there that in order to recognize Israel, Israel must pledge to some kind of Palestinian entity. So you might get, in the sort of law of unintended consequences, a better outcome for the Palestinians, nevertheless, in spite of everything I've was saying before that, under Trump than you would have under Kamala Harris. But you know, there are quite a lot of conjectures in that answer. It's a very fraught situation, and Trump holds no candle for the Palestinians. He really doesn't give a damn about them. We'll see.
Right. Thank you, sir. So after his victory, Trump remarked that a star is born, and he was referring to Elon Musk, of course, in the situation. And Musk and the Republican outreach often favor X, formerly Twitter, citing that there is an alleged left-leaning bias in legacy media. So, to what extent do you think Musk's acquisition of Twitter impacted the US election? And would you say that such left-leaning biases truly exist in legacy media?
I think Musk's use of Twitter, weaponization of Twitter as a Trump tool, was significant. It's very hard to measure. The metrics are, difficult, but he algorithmically, boosted Trumpian worldviews, boosted disinformation. One of the favorite ones that Musk and Trump sort of both hold in terms of lies. Is the idea that Kamala Harris and the Democrats generally bus in millions of illegal immigrants and they change the outcome of elections. There's really no evidence for this. And, the result of this election, ironically, demonstrates that. So that's sort of one example of disinformation, but goodness, I mean, the site is sort of really suffused with it. And as I say, the algorithm promotes that, and I can't believe it didn't have an impact on the election. I mean, just one example, this is not just X, this is also on other social media. Arab Americans were getting adverts and pushes that highlighted the Biden-Harris administration's callousness towards the people of Gaza and the sort of human carnage. And Jewish Americans were getting the exact opposite message, which was that the Israeli state is endangered by these radical Kamala Harris people. So you're getting an extremely dark but effective, customized targeting, which technology enables in ever greater sort of sophistication to go to people. And that's just one example, playing both sides in Israel of Jewish Americans and Arab Americans. There are many, many such examples that I could give you. How do you measure how many votes that change? It's very, very difficult to do so, but it's hard to believe it wasn't impactful. I mean, it's targeted at people who are not single issue voters, because all of us are multi-dimensional, but who are deeply motivated. And these were emotionally very impactful ads. I mean, I find it really odd, to describe the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal as left-wing media. But I think that our whole measure of left and right is now incredibly warped by our reaction to Trump. And so if you have criticisms of Trump, that means you're a communist, part of the communist media. That means you're left-wing. If you have fact checkers, if you print corrections, whatever it might be, if you have a sort of old world empirical approach to reporting, then that means you have a left-wing bias. So in other words, the bias towards trying to capture reality is left-wing. That to me is a sort of warping of what we used to mean by left and right, because if you look across the span of America's alleged legacy media, you'll get pro-free market, you'll get pro-public ownership, you'll get pro sort of open borders immigration, it'll get closed borders, reduced immigration. The whole span of opinions will be there. But I think the one thing that would unite a lot of legacy media is a sort of critical coverage of Trump, not necessarily anti-Trump, but holding him to account on fact-checking and such as over that, that whopping piece of disinformation on millions of illegal immigrants being bussed in to vote. So I don't really know how to respond to that. We're in a what's the word for it? I mean, the definition of knowledge. There's a sort of epistemological sea change going on, and I consider that the legacy media, part of which isn't dying, by the way. I mean, Financial Times, we keep increasing our paid subscription. The New York Times keeps increasing its paid subscription. TV networks are genuinely in a crisis because, it used to be that if you wanted to reach the public, you go through the television in their rooms. Now, you go through this and everybody has this. That really does pose an existential crisis for TV because everybody has a camera and it's mass distributed. It's not a centralized piping into people's homes anymore. So that, I think, is an inevitable thing. Print, though, is doing pretty well. I mean, or at least the sort of major print brands. And there is a lot of money around, as there is in India, for new media ventures that are online or whatever, multimedia. But there is a lot of capital around for media. And in some respects, even though we're in an age of existential media crisis, we're also in a golden age for the media, where it's both at the same time. So I find it quite hard to summarize, where that will take us.
Right, sir. And also, I think we are in an age right now where the wealth disparity is ever increasing, and that's not a problem limited to one nation. That's something we see internationally these days. And if we were to bring it back to India, the role of billionaires is omnipresent here as well. And this has come back to the limelight in recent times owing to the SEC's indictment of Adani. So, what are your thoughts on the growing oligarchical trend in India and around the world? And where do you think this trend is headed in the future?
So what's happened in India? I mean, India is one of the most unequal countries in the world. What's happened in India isn't necessarily unique to India. I mean, China is conducting a crackdown, has been for a few years now, on its super rich, because there's a belief that they challenge people like Jack Ma are challenging the communist monopoly on power, or at least rivaling the sort of attention. And so there's been a real clipping of wings of the super rich in China. China, though, if you look at it, the statistics is extremely unequal. India is up there. I forget what the Gini coefficients are for each, but they've both been heading north, which is the wrong direction if you believe in some degree of equality. India, of course, it's quite different in terms of the political relationship with the super rich, which has been very cozy. The Ambanis and the Adanis in particular have been close to the ruling party, and when with the BJP. I guess traditionally you had a slightly more genteel sort of Tata Birla relationship with with Congress governments. But the sort of macro trends beyond India, the global ones, are a winner takes all. Technology, the globalization of markets means your return on capital, if you are a winner, is just multiplied. I think there are specific conditions in India, including the political coziness with the really big titans that entrench their market dominance and their extreme wealth even more. There is a corruption issue in India, but there are also structural issues there about the ease of setting up a business. And it depends, of course, which state you're talking about in India. And generally speaking, the further south you go, the easier it is to start a business. and the more of a skilled labor force there is available for entrepreneurs. But I think there is a real difficulty of access to market for startups in India that Modi has not really addressed, and hasn't yet acted as a check on India's GDP growth rate. So I don't see this changing unless we have a sort of sharp electoral shift to the left in India or elsewhere. And we're not. We tend to be globally drifting to the right.
It's been rather interesting to hear such a perspective so far. So thank you for that. And of course, we had the last two questions about economics. And as we head towards the end of the interview, I can't go without asking you about Trump and Vance's ideas of protectionism and the economy. So many have cited that the reason they voted for Trump was the state of the American economy under the Biden and Harris administration. And Trump's economic plans are also attracting a lot of heat owing to his plans to increase tariffs and JD Vance's argument for devaluing the dollar. In light of these plans, how do you see the future of the US economy? And more importantly, how do you see the evolution of the United States' trade partnership with other countries?
It's a very good question. I mean, Trump's unpredictable. You know, the last thing that we were expecting was that he'd come out with a 25% tariff on Canada and 10% on China. This was pretty much the mirror image of what people were expecting. But he's a blusterer. He's not in office yet. He shouldn't actually technically be bargaining with anybody because he's not been inaugurated. But he does things in a very unorthodox way. He's a protectionist for sure. He's a mercantilist, in fact, and the mercantilists believe that trade should be in balance between countries, that deficits are a sign of unhealthiness. So the biggest deficit the United States has is with China. And his ultimate tariff plans, I think, are to impose much larger ones, up to 60% on China, and keep them lower for the rest of the world. Whether that actually happens or not is a different question, because there's a lot of talk with Trump and not always follow up with action. But he does want to eliminate the China trade deficit. All that will do is shift that deficit to other parts of the world. It won't repatriate production to the United States unless there's much more dramatic action, which would leave the world in depression, essentially. So what we'll see is what we've already been seeing, is the Chinese shifting supply chains and production facilities to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to Mexico, and so forth. So the overall US trade deficit will remain the same. It'll just reshuffle with whom it's growing and with whom it's falling bilaterally. What deficits are a function of is savings and investment. And I think Trump's kind of misunderstanding economics, and as he addresses that, America would have to save more, and that would shrink its deficit, and therefore it would have to spend less. Consumption would have to go down. I don't think that's what he's planning at all. He's Mr. Consumption. It will reduce, if he does implement these plans, it will reduce global growth. It'll hit all of our bottom lines. Eventually also America's bottom line. The more trade dependent you are, the more it will hit you. So smaller economies will get hit more than bigger economies. India will be affected less than Bangladesh. France will be affected less than Denmark. The US, like India, is not as trade dependent. If you add up trade as a share of GDP, it's a far smaller share than you get with a smaller country. It is the end, really, of the US-led world, post-World War world, the creation of the WTO, the promotion of globalization. It is the end of that. What I'm unclear about is what the precise sort of details and timing are of it. But it's clear that the American electorate has now twice voted for Trump, and Trump is very much against globalization. And so we're going to see a big shift. I just don't know at what speed and with what with what cost. But decoupling with China in some form is now going to happen, and the Biden administration's term of de-risking, which is a sort of more modulated version, that's going to give way to decoupling. And that's a radical change, radical, which will impact all of us in profound ways.
Thank you. So those are some very interesting takes. So as we conclude this interview with the final question, we've discussed a lot on both Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Donald Trump this evening. And it would be only right to point out that the last time these two leaders held office at the same time, we witnessed a lot of warmth between them, courtesy the ideological similarities, may that be both social or economic. So, how do you foresee the overall trajectory of the Indo American relations evolving now that we see them coming back for a second joint partnership?
I'd certainly expect a resumption. I think Trump's last visit overseas as president was to India, because then COVID hit. It was like a week or two before the global lockdown occurred. So it was late February or early March 2020. I forget the exact date, but I think that was his last visit. Went to the Narendra Modi Stadium in Ahmedabad, and if you remember all of that, and that succeeded Modi's several visits to the United States, the Howdy Modi reception in Houston. So clearly that affinity, and there is a sort of strongman club there too. Let's not downplay this. There isn't a liberal democracy club that they both are, paid up members of. There are sort of other people coming in who are very pro-India. Tulsi Gabbard, as Director of National Intelligence, she's a big Modi sort of booster in the United States. I think that the sort of larger geopolitics of India being, the largest sort of potential bulwark against China, that doesn't change whoever's in office. There is a sort of natural alliance, as the original phrase from Atal Bihari Vajpayee said about US-India relations when George Bush was president, when I was based in India at the time. That doesn't really change. They are sort of natural allies rather than formal allies. They will never be formal allies, and India will explore other things like BRICS. It'll try to manage its relations with China, not to get out of control, which we're seeing happening now, because China is just a lot more militarily powerful. Therefore, India will continue its sort of, I think, best expressed by the pragmatism of Jaishankar, your foreign secretary. It will continue this sort of ad hoc, a la carte approach to geopolitics, and that serves America. That's all really America wants. We'll see more Quad. That'll continue. What I think we've yet to see is the sort of scale of economic relations. There's always that promise of strong India-US economic relations, but it doesn't really manifest itself in the numbers like US-China relations do. And I think because of Trump's protectionism, it's not going to between Modi and Trump. So the mood music will look good. The geopolitics will show striking continuity. And they both like to demonize George Soros. They both have similar sort of playbooks and contempt for educated elites, etc. But I don't think that's surface stuff. I don't think the structural stuff underneath is going to change very dramatically.
It's been wonderful to listen to you, sir, over the past half an hour, and thank you so much for your time as well. It was